All right, welcome to part 2 of the religious deconstruction talks that I'm having with a friend of the dungeon, Jacob. Today we're going to focus on military evangelicism. I don't think I said that right. And since it's Valentine's Day, we'll talk a little bit about how the faith kind of injects itself into love. Jacob, how are you doing today?
We're good, baby. It's my favorite holiday.
Is it?
Oh,
Would you like to
God.
talk about that?
I just love Valentine's Day. So that's sarcasm.
Okay, yeah, I kind of
I
figured.
yeah, no, I hate. I'm really not that big of a fan of holidays in general. This one, in particular, is just a orgy of, you know, commodity exchange, blah blah.
Yeah, I'm fortunate to have a partner that's not too into that. Um,
Oh, nice.
her request this year is that we order a pizza, which is fine with me.
That's fucking perfect.
Yeah.
So do you want to? I guess. Yeah. So I was thinking like obviously like since I grew up Catholic and you grew up not, or what I guess like it was a non-denominational
Yeah,
evangelical.
non-denominational, but functionally pretty much exactly everything a Baptist church would be. Um,
Okay, yeah. I mean, I just so there's a certain impression that I have of evangelicals as having like a militant faith, um in that, and since we're sort of doing like militancy and love, like the intersection that I see, I guess, would be something like evangelizing or proselytizing, especially when it's overseas, because the mission is obviously to grow the kingdom, which, as I understand it, is language that I think evangelicals would use that Catholics would not. Like, that's another thing too, is like, I actually, there's someone I like tangentially know who is opening a church with her husband, that's an evangelical church, and they use the word kingdom, and it's just like,
yeah.
it,
Yeah, yeah.
to my ears, just rings so strangely because it, I guess, a, like a Catholic experience of the divine or faith isn't so much structured as a godly kingdom on earth. It's through the institution of the church. Um but so i guess but what I was going to say, I guess, about like overseas proselytization, is that there is this sense of doing it out of love, I think, in that you're saving people, you're turning them away from fallen lives and sinful lives, and bringing them into the arms of God, and blah blah blah. Um,
Yeah, I would
but
say you're pretty on point about that. Um, there's a couple of Bible verses that I've pulled up that kind of, I think, define a lot of the Protestant view of that sort of thing. Let's see if I can. So there's two ways that war is kind of interacted with in the Bible, and the Catholics and the Protestants are reading out of the same Bible, but we're talking about the same sort of thing where you've got very modern Muslims who read the same Quran, and then you've got the extremist radicals, and so there's
Mhm.
a lot of similar things going on there,
Right.
where both these groups are kind of picking and choosing what they look at or don't look at, and what they take up as like a metaphor, or take up as the express rule of what we're
Yeah.
supposed to be doing here on Earth. Um, so let me see. Um, had a couple of tabs. So yeah, there's two ways that war is talked about, and Protestants take both of them very seriously. So Ephesians 6:12 would be a good one. That says, "For we do not wrestle against flesh and blood, but against the rulers and against the authorities, against the cosmic powers over this present darkness, against the spiritual forces of evil in the heavenly places." So that's where you're talking about that proselytizing sort of thing, is you know uh, the understanding that we're not just fighting against man versus man or anything like that. It's there's a greater war for the soul going on, and
Yeah. Right.
in order to save these people, it necessitates that you preach the gospel to them and tell them that another thing that since we're talking about both militarization and love, is God so loved the world that he gave his only begotten son. So you're bringing this love to them, and you do it in a very warlike manner, where you're trying to root out some kind of great cosmic evil, as it says.
Yeah.
So that's one of the ways that war is talked about, and then there's a lot of like very real physical war that's talked about. um and then so you have the end times, and this is from Matthew 24, verses 3 through 8. Um, so this is Jesus. As he sat on the Mount of Olives, the disciples came to him privately, saying, "Tell us, when will these things be, and what will be the sign of your coming and of the end of the age?" And Jesus answered them, "See that no one leads you astray, for many will come in my name, saying, 'I am the Christ,' and they will lead many astray. And you will hear of wars and rumors of wars. See that you are not alarmed, for this must take place, but the end is not yet. For nation will rise against nation, and kingdom against kingdom, and there will be famines and earthquakes in various places. All these are but the beginning of the birth pains." So the second way that war is viewed by evangelicals is that things like Iraq and Afghanistan are necessary, because they're a part of this process of seeing us through to the end time. And
Yeah.
so it's not wrong for us to participate in that, because this is something that is ordained by God. And
Sure.
there was a very troubling leak. The leak wasn't troubling, but what was leaked was troubling. The Air Force had this training program for its like nuclear missile operators, and
Hmm.
the training program was essentially a bunch of verses like this, basically saying, "Hey, if you have to push the big red button, this is all fine, because this is what's supposed to happen, and the end times are unavoidable, and
Yeah.
also part of God's plan. So you're just unfortunately part of God's plan that's going to hurt you internally probably a lot, but it's something that you have to do."
Yeah. Well, and then I mean, like, even in terms of like foreign policy, like obviously Israel is the hot topic there, especially I don't well, so I guess I don't know so much about why or what would make wars in the Middle East particularly palatable or good, other than bringing greater control over Israel Palestine, um,
Yeah,
and like
so
ushering in Armageddon, like in a very real like the batshit prophecy per suite of prophecies that certain people believe, and and those people are elected officials, unelected officials, like appointees, like
Right.
and
So that goes into the Zionist aspect of all of this. Um and that's also very important in a lot of evangelical circles, because the Israelites are the chosen people of God. Um but it's also recognized that the Israelites won't make it to heaven because they don't believe in Jesus.
right.
Um, but we do have to preserve the Israelites because they're the chosen people of God. And before
Yeah.
this gets misconstrued into like being an anti-Jewish thing that I'm saying, it's not anti-Jewish so much as it's just um like a weird technicality sort of thing.
Well, it's the yeah. I mean, what these people believe, and
Right.
it's if anything, it's the prophecy itself that's anti-Semitic because essentially what these people believe is that Jews are pretty much like cannon fodder in the end times, where they die, like a set number of them, I think.
Yeah, there's
Do claim
200
Jesus.
200,000 or something like that will actually make it to heaven.
Yeah, it's yeah. Well,
And
and
that's
then
what the Jehovah's Witnesses believe is like their entire like faith structure is that only 200,000 people are going to make it to heaven. So that's
yeah,
why it's pretty funny when they try to like go around and recruit people
and
into.
yeah, right.
Yeah.
Yeah,
And
it's like
Jehovah's Witnesses are like even more like about the kingdom of God. Like
yeah,
all of their temples, churches, whatever you want to call them, are called kingdom halls and stuff
right.
like
Yeah.
that.
Yeah. So I guess maybe we can back up a little bit
Sure, yeah.
to well, because so I'm curious, I guess, what your upbringing like in
Yeah,
terms
and
of like leading through upbringing to military service to now, like what are the through lines that you, I guess, saw or have seen that kind of to you are like, okay, like I can attribute this to these people's belief systems, if that makes, you know what I mean,
no,
like.
no, no, yeah, no. So growing up in the church, there's usually two kind of services in
Mhm.
Protestant churches. I think this is much different than Catholic Church, in which like everybody just kind of attends the same sermon, I guess, so to speak, or same
Oh yeah, yeah,
like.
definitely.
So when and this is true for every Protestant church I've been to, um, except maybe like one or two small ones where they didn't really have the facilities for this sort of thing. But there's always a point where you have the worship service where you sing songs and stuff, and then at a certain point there's like a breakage where the kids go off to like a daycare sort of thing,
Hmm.
where there's like child oriented teachings, and then the adults stay behind in the main hall and get a more adult version of the Bible read to them, sort of thing. Um,
Hmm.
Different topics, topics that wouldn't maybe be appropriate for children, to be fair.
Hmm.
Um, like one thing, just kind of as an aside, and since we're talking about love, is how often uh, Protestant pastors get involved in like people's sex lives, like
Yeah,
not directly, but well, sometimes
like
directly too, but also just like the preaching
counseling.
about like what your sex life should be like, and
Yeah.
the subservience of women to men, and the the necessity to have children and whatever, and like just really weird ways that like the sex life of people is kind of manipulated on the bully pulpit, I guess. So when the children go off to their child oriented teaching, a lot of it's like a lot of like prepackaged sort of activities, sort of stuff, coloring books, a little like lesson on like, hey, Jesus loves children, and here's a nice story about Jesus. um but some of the like recurring themes that I remember growing up were the armor of God, which I'm sure you've
Hmm.
probably heard of.
Mm-mm.
Is like, no, you haven't. Oh, okay.
Mm-mm. No.
So the armor of God is from uh, Ephesians 6:10 through 20. And I'll read that to you. And this is something that I got read to a lot. And it's like some kind of cringy cosplay stuff, if we're being honest.
Yeah.
Um, but Ephesians 6:10 starts, finally, be strong in the Lord and in the strength of his might. Put on the whole armor of God that you may be able to stand against the schemes of the devil. For we do not wrestle against flesh and blood, but against the rulers, against the authorities, against the cosmic powers over this present darkness, against the spiritual forces of evil in the heavenly places. Therefore, take up the whole armor of God that you may be able to withstand in the evil day, and having done it all, to stand firm. Stand therefore, having fastened on the belt of truth, and having put on the breastplate of righteousness, and as shoes for your feet, having put on the readiness given by the gospel of peace. In all circumstances, take up the shield of faith with you, with which you can extinguish all the flaming darts of the evil one, and take up the helmet of salvation and the sword of the Spirit, which is the word of God. Um,
All
and
the like attributes of the armor too are like pretty much like inoculations against doubt as well. It's pretty much just like, you know,
exactly. And
you're
so,
you're prepared for this. This is certain. This is destiny. This is fate. You don't, you're girded by this uh kind of divine protection that, you don't need to worry. Um yeah, I mean, but it's like I don't I also just don't know. Like, it's just so foreign to me that it would be what a church is trying to like inculcate in its youth
well,
is
that's
to
why I
try.
think there's so much more of a militant aspect to evangelicism, because you're telling me that you've never heard of these verses before, having been in Catholic church as a child,
Yeah, in
and I'm like,
Catholic
this
school,
was like, this was something that was beaten in my head like repeatedly, is the armor of
Mhm.
God. And like, we would make little play armor pieces and
Right.
stuff in these little like child daycare services. um and that has an effect, I think, in, because kids like to run around and they like to play war or whatever, where they've got a little stick
Yeah.
gun and they're
Right.
shooting each other and whatnot. But when you also make it a part of your religion or your faith, that you're supposed to be a warrior, and you're supposed to have this militant, regimented aspect of your life. And there's another verse that I was going to bring up that talks a lot about authority, and I think it's kind of a um, troubling sort of thing to teach people, just as somebody who's not really pro authority. And this is Romans 13:1 through 7, and this is another one that not nearly as often as the armor of God stuff, but this was also kind of drilled into us in the churches that I went to. So Romans 13:1 through 7. Let every person be subject to the governing authorities, for there is no authority except from God, and those that exist have been instituted by God. Therefore, whoever resists the authorities resists what God has appointed, and those who resist will incur judgment. For rulers are not a terror to good conduct, but to bad. Would you have no fear of the one who is in authority? Then do what is good, and you will receive his approval. For he is God's servant for your good. But if you do wrong, be afraid, for he does not bear the sword in vain. For he is the servant of God, an avenger who carries out God's wrath on the wrongdoer. Therefore, one must be in subjection, not only to avoid God's wrath, but also for the sake of conscience. Because of this, you also pay taxes, for the authorities are ministers of God, attending to this very thing. Pay to all what is owed to them, taxes to whom the taxes are owed, revenue to whom the revenue is owed, respect to whom respect is owed, honor to whom honor is owed. So,
Yeah.
when you're told that, authorities are always right and they're always exacting, the will of God in their actions because God has appointed them, it's hard to, when that's your basis of understanding, it's hard to resist the idea that George Bush is in, you know, bringing us into a war with Iraq for the wrong reason.
Right.
And when you couple that with all the religious aspects of it and the and I don't know how strong this is in Catholicism, but for evangelicals, um, you know, Islam is seen as kind of a perversion of doctrine at the very least, or an evil faith in most circles. And so,
Yeah.
it's not, and it's just like another version of the Crusades, where
Yeah,
we're
for sure.
engaged in not only like a war for our nation that is just, but also a holy war for our faith.
Yeah. Well, and even yeah, I mean, well, so the Crusades are interesting. There are a couple different things that I was going to go through. So one, the verse, what you pointed out, it essentially just says, okay, all officials are they might be humanly appointed, but are also like divinely kind of
Yeah, and that's like the idea that God
guaranteed.
works in mysterious ways. So, he may have been voted in, but God was pulling the
But
strings
it's
behind the.
yeah, well, but it's also like you can't gainsay authority, because it is, if someone wields authority, it is by God's approval.
Yeah.
um which also kind of, I think would make someone desirous of power, which I think is wrong. I think, that's kind of the distinction between someone who's like, you know a good or bad politician, which, I'm sure plenty of people say, well, like, good politicians what? But, someone who is truly enamored of power, or someone who, you know is not, but knows how to wield power, or that power must be wielded in order to, effectuate positive change. um but then, even like, you know there has been a lot of crusading language, I think, with the war on terror, obviously, or
Yeah.
there is a sensibility of, either it's the Crusades, it's the Clash of Civilizations, whatever. But, you know, the fact of the matter is, the historical Crusades and what we see now in terms of American foreign policy in the Middle East is that, whether or not there's this kind of like religious fervor kind of laminated onto military action, the sort of brass tacks of it isn't really much in, to do with religion. It is truly about like flow of resources, and that's true of, you know securing oil. It's true of, securing the temple in the historical Crusades. It's not really to chalk it up wholly to religious belief is sort of a misguided attempt to make sense of what are like pretty complicated and like kind of like multifaceted.
Right.
um
Yeah. No, I agree completely. But that's how you get somebody who's 18 to join up.
right.
And fight, and it's the same thing with, the radical Islam, where, you convince somebody that they need to, blow themselves up for, their version of this side of the holy war. Um and you're basically doing the same thing with any, 18-year-old kid that decides to join the military. um 20 years old in my case, but at this point, I was fully ready and invested to die for
Yeah.
this cause, because I thought, not only was it a just war that we're fighting because Saddam Hussein is evil, and let's not say that Saddam Hussein was good, but I think what we've done over in Iraq is basically make a worse situation. Um, Different topic for a different day. But you know, I was fully committed to this idea that this was a just war, and that there was a holy war aspect to it that needed to be fought. And there was a lot of stuff going around back in kind of the earlier days when I joined in 2008, so the war had been going on for a while already. But a lot of the more veteran guys, were calling themselves like infidels and stuff like that, and
Yeah.
because the difference of religion there, actually. So yeah, I mean, there's a lot of interplay between, you know, obviously the reasons we went to war are more geopolitical and resource based, than a lot of people that are actually fighting the war understand or know.
Hmm. Yeah. Well, so like, did your was your family at the time, were they like gung ho supportive,
Absolutely, yeah.
and like not only of your involvement but of military
Yeah, so they weren't
intervention in general?
they weren't happy that I joined the military because they were, worried that I would die. Uh, but
Right.
but it wasn't that they thought I was doing a bad thing or anything like that. They were fully supportive of the war, and I remember, making the argument to my mother when I joined up, that like, Mom, you can't, like, on the one hand say that this is a good war and that we need to be involved with, and also get mad because I've joined. Like, somebody's got to
Right.
fight the war, right? And you
Yeah.
know I'm an able-bodied young man with all this faith that I have. This is So there was the period where I kind of fell away from faith, and then I got drugged back into it by, like, being shamed by the entire church, sort of thing. And so this was when I was, like, back in, kind of involved in the church. Was when I joined again. So I didn't quite have the same type of faith that I did when I was younger, but I still believed, um, more or less in the same things.
Mhm.
So I remember making that argument to her, and that didn't necessarily calm her down, but I think it helped her understand. And so that's
Yeah.
just another way in which the faith was used to kind of bully this position in of the war being okay and good.
Yeah. And did you run into much explicit faith, in, especially, like, I guess what I'm mostly interested in would be like using faith in instruction, not so much like the day-to-day beliefs of, a given service member. Like, that isn't terribly interesting, but like you mentioned, that the leak of, convincing these people to do things, like, what was that, like, sort of a daily or frequent thing in your,
um
like, instruction?
yeah, I wouldn't say that it was necessarily daily. i
Hmm.
know i know that previous iterations of, because boot camp changes over time. um
Sure.
if you watch something like Full Metal Jacket, back
Hmm.
then in the Vietnam War, drill instructors were allowed to beat the shit out of you if they felt it was necessary. That doesn't quite happen anymore, and so there's also been kind of a culture shift in America where America has become a little bit more secularized, so it's not quite as obvious sometimes. But one of the things is there's a drill movement. So when you're marching around and you're receiving all these orders, left, right, left, stand in place, stand at parade rest, or stand at attention, whatever. There's a drill movement, where if the drill instructor says, "Let us pray," you're, like, immediately supposed to bow your head, and the chaplain will then go into a prayer. So there
Hmm.
there there is some regimented, kind of drilled into you sort of things. And then the other thing is that Sundays were basically the only free day in boot camp,
Hmm.
to kind of do anything that wasn't training related. And there was always the option to go to church, and church, especially in boot camp, is where it was already bad kind of growing up with all this militant sort of stuff and just a regular church. But when you go to church in boot camp, that's like all it
Yeah,
is
yeah,
like
for sure.
talking about how you're a warrior for Christ, and put on the full armor of God because it's the only thing that's going to save you in battle, and
Yeah,
pray for the souls of your enemies, but understand that you have to annihilate them regardless of whether or not you love them, sort of stuff. So that was especially, and even to me as somebody who had faith, I was like, man, this is kind of creepy,
right.
like,
Yeah,
this is this is like a
yeah.
step too far.
Well, it's all like, I mean, that kind of preaching combined with the regimented lifestyle, but then also just kind of the drilling and the automatic like
Yeah,
bodily
for
responses
sure.
to orders, like it
Absolutely.
there's just like a feedback loop almost of obedience
Hmm.
that I think obviously like something like having that sort of religious instruction would almost prime you for, I think, probably. Yeah, I mean, it's just it's but it's also like it's kind of like I shudder to think of the like the person of deep religious conviction who preaches that gospel. In the sense that like I despite my like kind of both disregard and disdain for people who, not all religious people, but people who especially use it to kind of pursue control over other people. But like, I have an idea of religious people that's sort of like hopeful that they're not bad people, and so it's like it's particularly like loathsome and disgusting to me to think that you could have someone in a pulpit saying like, you know, you're a warrior for Christ, go kill the Muslim dogs, et cetera, et cetera, especially when they're doing it in the context of the military. Since you're obviously also being trained and given the means to actually go out and do that, and it's not so much
Right.
like rhetoric, it's marching orders of
No,
like literally
absolutely. Yeah.
go kill these people.
Yeah, and I would say, that's one of the things that I think is, uh both about the military and the church, is that, you take people who have good intentions, and maybe they just don't understand exactly what they're doing, and you
Mhm.
give them, exactly like you said, basically marching orders. And this person has been told their entire life that, authority is there by divine mandate. You're supposed to be warlike in how you approach this sort of thing. You have to go save the souls of everybody else in all the different countries that don't believe in Jesus Christ, and anybody who believes in the Quran is horribly misled or outright evil.
Right. Yeah.
So you have people who genuinely want to, and I'm it sucks because I don't have these people in my life anymore, but I for all the bad things I could say about the church, I met some people who are just also incredibly decent human beings, who are good and loving, and really poured their heart and soul into not only just the church but the community, and uh, the unfortunate like injection of the faith that came along with that, notwithstanding, they were doing good things, like
Mhm.
I talked about how I went on a mission trip and I built an orphanage. Like,
Mm.
building an orphanage is a good thing. And so
Yeah.
you're taking people who really want to do good in the world and perverting their sense of what good is. um and this is true for the military too. I didn't meet anybody in the military who, I mean, there were a couple of shitheads here and there, of course, but nobody joined the military just because they wanted to hurt the world. They thought that what
Right.
they were
Yeah.
doing was, the right thing, and that, there
Yeah.
was an element of sacrificial sort of act happening in all this, like, yeah, I'm putting my life on the line, but it's for, a better world sort of thing. So, I'm willing to make this sacrifice in order for the world to be a better. And so you're taking people who have that belief and that faith and perverting everything that would be good into something that's necessarily harmful.
Yeah. Well, and it's like what's kind of crazy too is, the well, and I guess there's a question then of, can can the scripture necessarily lead to sort of a communist politics? Because like I guess the reason I say this is, the people who are using Christianity are weaponizing it for radically conservative political ends.
Yeah.
Um, but and the reason I'm thinking about this is, your point that, these are people who truly do want to do good in the world. They're not. It's not um, a bit. It's not underhanded. It's just that goal is perverted by this kind of marriage of that intention with nutty religious beliefs. But it's unfortunate to think that you have all these people who are invested in doing better and better in the world, and then also, diametrically opposed to something like a socialist politics or communist politics or whatever.
Yeah,
And
and
especially like, but even the you know obviously before there was the war against Islam, there was the Cold War, which itself was, a holy war. It was a war against, godless communists and just the complete kind of secular a secular world completely like kind of stripped of its divine halo.
yeah,
And
absolutely.
it was an existential threat on not only like on geopolitical lines, but also just the degree to which, it takes God out of the equation. Um,
Yeah, so it kind of goes back into what I was saying earlier about how the difference between whether or not somebody can be a socialist Christian like Cornel West or like a
mm-hmm.
militant conservative is kind of just what you determine is, either metaphor or, like an actual given order in the Bible. Because, you know, Jesus said plenty of troubling things about how wars are necessary, but he also said a lot of things about how, if your neighbor doesn't have bread and you don't give him bread, you're kind of a piece of shit for that.
Right.
So there's
Yeah, and I think
plenty
we
there's
talked
plenty of
about.
yeah, we talked about it a little bit last time. And Cornel West is like the only person I can think of off the top of my head that identifies himself as a socialist Christian. I can't really think of a
Yeah,
lot of other. It's definitely a minority position in the church, I would say.
there
Um,
was of course her name is escaping me now, but there was a woman who I think started an organization just called the Catholic Workers or something like that. And it was definitely a woman, but yeah, I mean, I think it's far less. It makes more sense that religion is wedded to conservative politics than not.
yeah, it's
Get
easier to, I think,
I
because
think it's much more about like my own kind of like wish and optimism and hope that
yeah,
things could be better, to say, oh well, like how can you be a believer and be a reactionary? I mean, because to me, like, you know, Oh, and that's what's so strange about evangelicals in particular, though, is their fascination with Christ and the figure of Christ, and yet, you know, to think about what his actual lifestyle was, what it's just so diametrically opposed to how those people live or would think it's appropriate to live.
Yeah, and I mean you have all these big names like Joel Osteen,
Yeah,
Ken, whatever the fuck his name is. That
yeah,
dude
like,
that looks like an actual living demon with like the crazy
yeah.
eyes and shit. The
Oh,
one that had the COVID-19 song thing. Remember
yeah,
him?
Kenneth
Yeah,
Copeland, I think.
yeah, Kenneth Copeland. Man. You've got all these what are they called?
Prosperity gospel,
Prosperity
charisma.
gospel people. Um, and it's like, that was one of my big falling outs with the church was people who were watching all these prosperity gospel preachers, and it's like, that like Jesus said it's harder for a rich man to enter heaven than a camel through the eye of a needle.
Right. Yeah.
And so yeah, there's a strong case to be made that Jesus was in some ways a communist. um I don't think he believed in like a state-run communism or anything like that. If he was real in the first place, let's go ahead and get that aside. But according to what he says in the Bible, or what he supposedly says, and is
Right.
recorded in the Bible, um, there's a strong case to be made that he believed in some kind of Christian commune society that
Yeah.
would take care of its own and use its resources as a net benefit to everybody rather than wealth hoarding for the individual.
Yeah. Which I mean, but and again, like I think we talked a little bit last time about just kind of like the colonial context of Jesus, like the historical Jesus, and like of course it makes complete sense. But this is also a note that is missed by evangelicals, is that the Bible is a historical text, because they don't read that, and they don't read anything about, they wouldn't be inclined to read anything about the Romans' interactions with Israel and say, okay, this is actually referring to like actual material, real historical events and processes. They would go straight to, this is a metaphor
Yeah.
for, which is a mistake. And because I think if you were inclined to read it historically and say, okay, here's a figurehead of a movement who is trying to wrest control and autonomy from this colonial power, and and give a group of people self-determination, autonomy, it makes more sense to think, okay, yeah, of course this guy is uh sort of campaigning against wealth hoarding, because the people who become wealthy are those who ally themselves with this
Yeah,
colonial power,
for sure.
who ally themselves with power itself. And I guess, yeah, it's a little bit of just no one wants to see themselves as the villain, and I think that is it. There, people get painted into corners thought process wise, where you know um it doesn't, they're people cannot think themselves out of, okay, I should listen to fucking Kenneth Copeland, who's wealthy. Well, one, there's an American cult of wealth. There's an American disposition to listen to a certain um kind of heroism of the wealthy. Like our first rock stars and saints were robber baron capitalists. and now who themselves used a lot of weird religious shit. I mean, like that. Yeah, I don't know.
Yeah,
There's all sorts of shit to talk about there, but like, yeah, I mean, like, of course, someone's gonna listen to Kenneth Copeland because he's telling them he's giving them a certain kind of comfort in terms of his actual religious teachings, but then also, if part of the theology is if someone is wealthy, then they must be godly. Then
yeah, it's because they have some kind of moral strength, some kind of divine
yeah,
strength that's
yeah,
allowed them to become wealthy because they've done so much good, or they are so good that they succeed in this way.
right. Yeah, well, I mean, they pretty nakedly say that as well.
Yeah.
I mean,
No,
the opens of the world.
that's part of like the cycle of reasoning. It's a very circular logic where this very obscenely rich person who owns a private jet is talking to a poor person and saying, hey, I have all this money because I am morally righteous. And if you don't have a lot of money, it's because you have some kind of failure in your faith or your righteousness.
Yeah,
So if you were more righteous, and one of the reasons that or one of the ways that you become righteous is by giving 10% of the church, which is me.
yeah, exactly. Yeah,
So it just
yeah.
kind of
Give
cycles
me
on
more.
itself, right?
Yeah, you gotta tithe to you gotta. It's like
Yeah.
I guess somehow that righteousness rubs off on you by giving people money. Um,
Yep, and the there's a very abusive way that the story about the poor woman who gives her 1 shekel, but that's like all of her worldly wealth versus all the rich men who are only giving like just a little bit.
yeah,
Um, that's kind of used in an abusive way in the church, where it's like, hey, look, if this poor person who was the most morally righteous out of any of them can give away all of her stuff, then you can too,
yeah,
and then that's how you
right.
become
Yeah,
closer
exactly.
to
Yeah,
God.
yeah. Well, and it's even like what's kind of odd about the prosperity gospel, especially, is part of what was at issue in the Reformation was indulgences.
Hmm.
And it's like,
Paying to have your sins washed clear.
yeah, it's like, yeah, what's the difference?
Hmm.
It's but again, it's the fact that there is no sort of like historical sensibility or historical consciousness. It's just, well, this guy's rich. If you're rich, you're godly. I'm going to give him my money, and
Yeah,
that's
so that's kind of the grift there. That's basically the entire thing.
yeah,
With that aspect of it, anyways.
yeah,
We're reaching about 50 minutes, and we were talking about how we kind of wanted to keep these shorter. So I don't know
yeah.
if you have any final thoughts that you want to leave with.
No, I mean, you know, tithe, say your prayers, eat your green
Yeah.
vegetables.
We just spent 40 minutes talking about how all this is harmful. So let's end it
Yeah,
on go ahead and do all that though.
yeah.
Yeah. All right. Well, thanks again for your time. I will be uploading this shortly, and this is again part 2 of a however many part series we end up doing. I think these are fun talks. So I know that a couple of now reformed Christian friends of mine have enjoyed these, so or
Nice.
enjoyed the last one that we did. So um, hopefully it's helpful to somebody. If not, then it's just a fun conversation we're having.
Oh
So,
yeah.
all right. Well, thank you very much, and have a good
All
rest of
right.
your day.
Peace. Happy Valentine's Day.
Yeah, same to you. Hi, Michael Deebs here, with no gun pointed at my head. Please know that all content created for the Benzo Rehab Dungeon is and always will be freely available. However, if you would like to support this creation of content, we here at Camp Benzo would appreciate it, as the production itself is not free of cost. Anything donated will go to covering the various subscription fees maintained for our content production or improving and expanding the content produced. If you are able to, please head on over to patreon.com/benzorehabdungeon. We also have shirts for sale on Teespring, all priced as low as we can get them without turning much or any profit. They are mostly so that you can show your loved ones that a necessary intervention may be on the horizon. Links to the merchandise storefront and our various social media profiles can be found on our link tree, which is the word link tr.ee/benzo rehab dungeon. As always, we love you. Please take your medicine.